Kia ora koutou katoa. I'd like to thank Michelle Blah, the General Manager of Fair Food, for coming and speaking at St Luke's this Sunday. Fair Food tries to address part of the issue of food security in our country. We live in what to the world looks like a wealthy place, with education, health and social welfare systems provided to the populace. However, while many of us are financially stable and live reasonably secure lives, there are many who don't. As Michelle's slides will show, 20% of the children in our city live in homes where food runs out sometimes or often, and 7% run out of food completely by the end of the week. 58% of the lowest income families in New Zealand have no access to fruit and vegetables. Yet we are a country that produces enough food to feed 40 million people. New Zealand's population is 5 million. And also a country that has significant food waste. Both the biblical readings today, albeit written some 900 years apart, one from 1 Kings and one from Mark, are both about food security. Food shortages were common in the ancient world. Sometimes the causes were climatic, but more often due to the actions and policies of the powerful and rulers, whether through wars, taxation, or the various means that the rich and influential have and still have, in furthering their ends to the detriment of the wider populace. Both Elijah and Jesus were considered prophets, leaders, and teachers. Their mana, their authority, was grounded in their concern for the marginal and vulnerable. We need to understand the purpose of miraculous feeding stories, such as that of the never-empty jar of the widow of Zarephath, our first reading, or Jesus feeding 4,000 and then again 5,000 people with bread and fish. These stories say firstly that God is not in the pockets of or the service of the wealthy. Rather, God cares about the widow, the hungry, the foreigner, and the sick. God cares about whether people have enough to eat and whether they can pay for it or not. And God will provide. Secondly, these stories are an encouragement to those who have enough to share to do so. They are a call to all people everywhere, like God, to care about hunger and all that weighs down the vulnerable, and do something about it. These stories are not about sitting on our hands and waiting until some miracle worker walks into town to fix it, but rather they're about us joining with others to be that miracle, to be that fix-it that is needed. We need collectively to be the energy and goodwill called God, and not let the obstacles, including the obstinacy of lawmakers and laws designed to protect the status quo, prevent us. The reading from Mark 7, Jesus and the Syrophoenician woman, also touches on food and access. It tells of a woman, tradition calls her Justa, petitioning Jesus for her daughter's welfare. And then when Jesus is disparaging, she displays a feistiness in challenging his response. Note, feistiness is a virtue, and it's also a prayer. The text makes clear the obvious distinctions between Jesus and Justa, namely ethnicity, religion, and gender. Jesus is a male Palestinian Jew, and Justa is a female Syrophoenician non-Jew or Gentile. But there's another distinction here too that the scholar Andrew McGowan points out. Justa is seemingly presented as an inhabitant of wealthy Tyre, and thus she comes from a population whose relationship with rural Galilee, Jesus Turangawawa, was quite unequal as well as ethnically fraught. Ancient cities were parasitic on their rural hinterlands, particularly for food, grain, bread. Her place relative to Jesus was thus not necessarily marginal or oppressed at all. And ethnicity, religion was not the sole or primary form of barrier between them. So when Jesus responds to her request with the infamous metaphor of children and dogs potentially competing for food, he is certainly beginning with a Jewish exclusivity that could be seen as chauvinistic and racist. Dogs, some have suggested, being a derogatory way of referring to Gentiles. However, the centrality of food here requires more reflection about who is being marginalized and how. Galilean peasants relative to wealthier Greek, that is Gentiles, and other city dwellers experience food shortage daily. This is why we get the multiple miraculous feeding miracles in the Jesus tradition. Food is a big issue. We also need to understand the reference to children as a reference to those who are vulnerable and dependent and often deprived in rural, impoverished Galilee. The children's access to bread, the word in Greek is indeed bread, not just food. Children's access to bread was not at all secure, and the concern of small households was to obtain it daily. Thus, Jesus is quite right to underline the necessity of feeding the children, the vulnerable. Jesus uses the same word for the children being fed as appears in the feeding story of the 5,000. The issue is not the status, but the necessity of satisfying hunger. Of course, the metaphor has an uncomfortable aspect, not least with the dogs. This is, of course, not complimentary, but it is a metaphor, and its reference is about responsibility. He is not, by the way, calling her a dog. The image is about the order of access to the necessity of food, not the character of the participants. Families are responsible for feeding their own members, including their children. Justa herself, while demonstrating a striking willingness to engage Jesus beyond social norms, actually accepts the premise of the difficult metaphor rather than challenging it. It is unlikely that she is supposed to find it offensive or surprising at all. Were a Jew seeking something from her, the dynamics of power and responsibility would simply be reversed. In any case, her desire to have Jesus intervene in her daughter's healing causes her to press the point within the household image that Jesus offers. Yes, dogs, domestic dogs here, would get fed too, just not first. Justa is certainly a model of faith beyond expectation or norm. But Jesus' surprising capacity and willingness to fulfill the needs of Gentiles as well as of the children is the point of this pericope. Jesus, like Elijah, in a context where the powerful and rulers control much of the mechanisms of food production and distribution. Is portrayed as one who channels the concern and provision of God to the vulnerable, the children, and those impoverished. And just to remind Jesus that the boundaries of this divine concern and provision are not restricted by race, religion, or even species. Yes, God's concerned about dogs too. Blessings to you this week.